Hey folks, as part of a collaboration with the TDRC, the Titan Dreamers Resource Center, we are doing a series with Dr. Allison Varzally from History about the longer history of immigration, the role of immigrants in our American society and culture, and what American policies have looked like over the course of US history. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Great, thanks for the opportunity. I'm excited about the conversation.
Yeah. So today we're talking about immigration to the United States. What are we talking about when we talk about immigration? How do we define that? How do we conceptualize that?
Yes, and this is, I think that's a fundamental question. I think it's been kind of debated by kind of historians and other social scientists. And one definition, and we can always question definitions, is kind of the migration of people across national borders on a voluntary basis. And of course, voluntary is not an absolute position either, right? Many people are, it's hard to move, right?
So hard, yeah.
You are separating from family, separating from community, separating from sacred places, right? So to some degree, immigration is often maybe not always what you want to do, but I think we would make the distinction between kind of the forced migration of enslaved people and the immigration of kind of national kind of citizens to another kind of nation. I think, and then maybe also a distinction, that national borders are not always agreed upon. And so that in that case, if you are migrating across that border, some would call that immigration. Some would say that is just kind of movement, right?
Yeah. Can we dig in a little deeper here too, right? Like, so you point out, and I think this is true, that the decision to migrate, like that's a big decision. What are the types of calculations that people think through, or you've seen people in your historical work think through when deciding to make this jump?
Yes, absolutely. And I should say maybe there are some who are so adventurous oriented, and that it is an exciting or undeliberative decision.
Yeah.
But I think for many, it's a kind of a calculation of current opportunities, especially around jobs, right? I would think oftentimes it's hard to disentangle a discussion or a study of immigration from a discussion of labor, because that has been a primary reason. I think also, do you feel free, right, in your speech, in your religious practice? Do you feel like you have opportunities for your family? Are there people that you know who have already left, right? That oftentimes, I think there's inevitably networks, right? And so if there are pioneers, or not pioneers, first goers, right, who have established themselves and have sent maybe money or communicated about opportunities, then you feel like you've got a place to go. So I think that transnational exchange or network has also powered immigration. And then for some, I think the circumstances are so dire, right, that they are literally fearing for their lives, right? Then I think that has been a motive as well.
Now, what about to kind of shift the lens to a nation? And I heard strands of this in your earlier discussion, so I'm just kind of pulling out some of this. Like, when does a nation decide that it benefits them to welcome folks in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of it is, I guess, the evolution of a nation's immigration policies. And as a nation becomes more, I guess, established, as I guess the federal government becomes more assertive in foreign policy, and you can see immigration policy of a nation as an extension or a part of foreign policy. And one of the things that's at least happening in the United States in really the 1870s and 1880s is the courts, the Supreme Court is defining the right to regulate immigration as a federal power rather than the power of states. And that previous to those decisions, part of this is that the federal government was largely, I guess, if not indifferent, inattentive to immigration because it thought that immigrants were so valuable to economic productivity, to economic growth. And so I think that kind of defines. But your question of how the other part, I think, of immigration policy maybe to mention is what's happening in the sending countries with their emigration policy. So kind of two examples. One from like the 1870s to 1920s, which was a period of heavy European immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. A lot of those countries are despairing about the departure of their citizens, their people. They're missing conscripts for their military. They're missing, laborers to harvest their crops. Religious authorities are concerned that these immigrants are going to be demoralized and secularized in the United States. And maybe another example, thinking about the 1970s and Mexico's immigration policy, right? That one of the ways that they responded to kind of the displacement of rural residents is by encouraging emigration, right? With the hope of remittances and the hope of maybe developing skills and knowledge that those immigrants would then bring back to Mexico, right? So I think the immigration policy in relationship with the nation's immigration policy, I think, is really an interesting dynamic interaction.
So, in kind of broad terms, as you've laid out, a nation at different times makes different calculations about its immigration policy. What are some of the wide sweeps that we've seen in the United States about its immigration policy?
I think one of the big sweeps from not immigrating or not regulating immigration to gatekeeping. I think that's one of Erica Lee's phrase that really originates in response to Chinese laborers in the 1860s and 1870s, right? So kind of a turning point in federal management and kind of national immigration policy is the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And that's the very first time in US history that a group is excluded or restricted on the basis of both class and race, right? So Chinese laborers. And that becomes kind of arguably a precedent for American immigration policy to the present. But it also sets up a period of restriction that I would say kind of culminates in 1924. So you have more immigration restrictions in 1917, and then in 1924 you have a law that all but prohibits immigration from Asia and sets up, and this was overly complicated, but it was effectively and practically a way of excluding or really dropping the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. You have national quotas. So if you look at kind of if you look graphically at the rises and falls in immigration patterns, you see a really precipitous fall in immigration from 1880 roughly because of the 1924 Act until 1965. And then I think another major turning point is the 1965 immigration reform. And some historians have argued that was as much a civil rights triumph as the Voting Rights Civil Rights Act, in that it was driven by this idea that the U.S. should not be using kind of race as a criteria for entry. And so the policy that came out of 65 that arguably we still have today with a lot of different kind of revisions in terms of enforcement, favors family reunification, kind of certain professional categories, and refugees. And that was seen more in line with American principles than kind of using kind of race and class as the primary, I guess, deterrence.
Okay. So I'm going to kind of like walk us a little more slowly through the
Sure,
1882. Was that the exclusion?
Yeah.
Okay. So when America first starts prohibiting, when America first starts gatekeeping immigration,
Mm-hmm.
what is the logic of the choices they're making? Who are they deciding to keep out and why?
Yeah. There is a really robust anti-Chinese movement that gains ground from the 1860s into the early 1880s.
Yeah.
And it is driven in large part by American laborers, especially in the American West, because the Chinese immigrant population was concentrated in the West, right? So if you were from New York or Philadelphia or Mississippi, it was unlikely that you were familiar or would have met or encountered a person who had immigrated from China, right? So it's striking that this what will become a precedent of gatekeeping really originates in the West in response to Chinese. So, to your question, laborers, including other immigrant laborers, the Working Men's Party is a political organization that is whose members are working class, including a lot of Irish workers, who are a little bit more established than Chinese. And some would say this is one of the tragedies of history, right? That groups are not finding common cause around their working position. So workers are driving it. I think there's also concern not only with Chinese laborers as competition for American jobs, and here you hear a lot of echoes in today's debate that the Chinese are taking American jobs because they accept lower wages. They're are willing to work under more hazardous conditions, and that an American, often male worker, deserves more. But there's also concern about what is seen as the foreignness of Chinese culture. And there's some really evocative, often disturbing, but really powerful political cartoons that display China, the quote, strangeness of Chinese, right? Focusing on whether it's religious practices, or whether it's that there are mostly male Chinese immigrants, and that some of these men are doing work that is scripted as women's work, and does that make them unmanly? So that's part of kind of the building anti-Chinese sentiment, and violence too, right? So that it's not just rhetoric, that it spills over into everyday harassments, attacks on the camps of Chinese workers. There are employers who are intervening on behalf of Chinese workers because they appreciate how they reduce their labor costs and therefore their bottom line. So there are sides to the debates. Both political parties, and Democrats and Republicans, fairly quickly are united, despite being on supposedly different sides of the political platform, on an opposition to Chinese. And this is despite the fact that the United States is trying to negotiate more open markets with China, and it's concerned then about I guess the condition or the position of Chinese workers in the United States, because China is leaning in to the U.S. State Department and other kind of leadership, saying, "Hey, what is going on here? You know, this is not appropriate." And so there is some momentary protections for Chinese laborers, but those are ultimately kind of overwhelmed by the intensity of the sentiment, and I guess the lack of commitment. So,
so this kind of circling around this idea that we need to protect American-born laborers and protect American culture. And then when we go forward to the creation of the quotas in 1924, I assume that means that specific countries got an allotment of individuals. So can you tell us a little more about what 1924 looks like?
Sure, absolutely. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act pretty effectively reduces the immigration of Chinese laborers, although there's also some really great stories about how they circumvent that restriction. And I also, it's kind of fascinating in contemporary parlance when people talk about undocumented immigration. I think usually what they imagine is immigration from Latin America or Mexico, but really the first undocumented immigrants to the United States were Chinese, right? Because you can't be you first of all, you need the restriction right before you can become undocumented. So that effectively restricts Chinese immigration, but because of intensified industrialization, there is continued demand for workers, and a lot of those workers are coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. A lot of those workers, and this was a distinction that many American Protestants made, that these Europeans from Southern and Eastern Europeans seemed stranger because they were not speaking English. That was not their native language. Many of them were Roman Catholic. That had also been a problem for Irish in the 1840s. And so there is concern, much like in the case of the Chinese, that these newcomers are not American enough. Again, a kind of narrow construction of American culture, and that they're maybe stealing American jobs. So that those worries, that nativism shapes the 1924 legislation, which, as you said, sets up national quotas. They are allotments, and the size of the allotment, and this was obscure, but it was deliberate, was based upon the percentage of that immigrant group that was present in the U.S. in 1890. But because Eastern and Southern Europeans were not coming to the U.S. in 1890 yet, basically the effect was a very small allotment for those coming from Italy or from Poland or for Russia, and pretty large allotments if you're coming from Germany or France or Great Britain, right? So it's rigged in a way that favors certain immigrant groups and not others, on kind of cultural and economic grounds.
And then you said in 1965, in a way, this is a civil rights movement where this whole conceptualization is questioned.
Yes.
And say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, so the civil rights movement and those ideas that are brought by kind of a range of activists in the United States, that is kind of shaping thinking about immigration, right? And whether that immigration policy is aligned with these ideas of kind of equality and justice. And by 1965, a number of the legislators are themselves the descendants of European immigrants that had come before 1924, right? And just as in kind of the 1960s, there is a celebration or increasing kind of celebration of one's kind of ethnic roots and racial roots and a sense of kind of pride. And I think collaboration and celebration around that, I think that is happening also with the descendants of Europeans, right? And so those legislators are part of the conversation about immigration reform. And so the reform that passes, and there's a pretty evocative image of LBJ with the Statue of Liberty behind him signing this reform into law, it gets rid of those allotments, right? And so now the new policy isn't supposed to be based upon allotments. It's not supposed to be about these absolute exclusions of laborers or groups on the basis of race, but around these categories that seem kind of fairer, right? Or more egalitarian. And one is family. Do you have family in the United States, or will you have family in the United States? Do you have kind of a profession or skill that is in demand? Are you a refugee? And the distinction that is made, and refugee is a political category, so it's really the federal government that decides who is a refugee, who is leaving their country because of political persecution rather than kind of economic opportunity. So the refugees after 1965 tend to be those who are leaving from communist countries, right? Vietnam, right? Other parts of Southeast Asia, and the Soviet Union, from Cuba. Those are immigrants that are coming in as kind of refugees. So
yeah. And have we been under that 1965 model up until now? Are we still under that?
We are, with some important kind of caveats and changes. And I think what also happens in 1965 is that the U.S. for the first time imposes a quota on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So what that means is that the U.S.-Mexico border that had been open relatively, now there is a quota essentially on the number of immigrants that are coming from Latin America, including Mexico. And the challenge, of course, is patterns of migration across that border through the 19th and 20th century have now been interrupted. The Bracero program, which is an emergency guest worker program introduced during World War II to try to resolve labor shortages that essentially brought in Mexican agricultural workers. That program is canceled in 1965. So essentially that the combination of the end of the Bracero program and the establishment of this quota on the Western Hemisphere makes it a lot harder for those coming from Latin America and Mexico to come to the United States, right?
What is that justification, right? Like what? Why get rid of quotas in one area, create these broad categories accessible to everybody, and then institute quotas?
Yes, and I think that it's a great question. Part of it is, I think, growing kind of nativism in the American Southwest.
Okay.
I think as these other immigrant groups that are now kind of enabled are coming to the United States, there's less demand for Mexican and Latin American immigration. There's a little bit more kind of balance in the source of labor. I think also just the sheer numbers, and I don't know Mexican history as well, you have to get Neufeld here. But I think it also has to do with political and economic changes in Mexico, right? That there are greater incentives to leave Mexico after 1965, especially in the 1970s. And so there's essentially just a lot more demand at the same time that the U.S. has placed this new kind of restriction on immigration from that hemisphere.
I think you're very clearly laying out, that the federal government is trying to be attuned to different regions and how hard it is to balance those regions, right?
Absolutely. And that gets also, I think, at the tension between, and we see this today, between the states and federal government around immigration, right? And I think at various points, the states have argued, whether it's Arizona, probably about 15 years ago, who claimed that the federal government was not sufficiently enforcing the border and then tried to take enforcement measures into their own hands. But then also today, I think where a state like California would argue that current federal immigration policy and practice is punitive, and that the states need more control over immigration, right? Whether through kind of sanctuary cities or other protections of immigrants in the wake of kind of ICE raids. So I think that's part of the story of kind of state versus federal power and who is controlling immigration.
Is there anything else you want to say about what's changed since 1965?
Yes. 1986, not to just define immigration history by legislation, but sometimes it's a useful organizing event. So in 1986, and this was building up from both growing kind of anti-immigrant sentiment in the 1970s, and also concerns about a growing population of undocumented immigrants. And the undocumented population increases after, again, 1965, in large part because of those new restrictions, right? The cancellation of the Bracero program, and then also this new quota, right? So the 1986 reform under Ronald Reagan is a negotiation to try to address the challenge many thought of undocumented immigration. And so it sets up an amnesty program so that immigrants who were able to provide or prove that they had been in the United States before 1983, that they would have a pathway to citizenship. That was one part. The other was that it committed to a much tighter enforcement of borders, particularly the US-Mexican border, and it set up sanctions for employers who didn't scrutinize the citizenship status of their workers. So it kind of gave and didn't give. You know, I was reading recently for kind of another project, kind of the reaction of you know, local populations in Southern California to the passage, and there was some hope, right, about now that undocumented would have this pathway to citizenship, would have a kind of visibility and rights, but also fearfulness under this new kind of enforcement regime, that maybe they wouldn't have the right papers, or that now it would become even harder maybe to cross the border or to reunite with family. And then, please.
Oh yeah, no, I was going to say, I do hear those things today working in tandem, like the argument that until we really secure the border, we can't think about amnesty, right? So I think I still hear that being held in balance right now too.
Absolutely, and I think that the reference point of 1986, which arguably it did not. For some would say that it did not reduce undocumented immigration, right? That did continue after 1986. So for some who thought, well, maybe the amnesty and the border enforcement would kind of resolve that tension, given kind of current debates, some doubt that was as effective as had been hoped. And then I think in the 90s, there is, and there's always tension, right? I would say kind of in US history between a kind of a celebration and a welcome of immigration. And we're going to get to the part where we get to talk about kind of the contributions and the ways immigrants have shaped this country. There seems like there's a tension between that more kind of positive, kind of cosmopolitan vision of a nation and this more pessimistic, kind of anxious version. And in the 90s, you see a little bit more of that anxiety again. A couple things that are proposed. First, Proposition 187 in California, right? And we are other than Hawaii, I think the most kind of multi-descent state in the United States. We have kind of a really rich immigrant tradition, but it was here that a proposition was introduced, and it did pass, even though the courts did, kind of ripped it apart, said it was not constitutional, but it passes in California. And what it does is it withholds fundamental services to undocumented immigrants, including health services, education. And I think, so you see kind of the intensity of anti-immigrant sentiment here, and that informs the Republican Party policy under the contract with America in the 1990s. And the Republican Party, I think, begins to adopt more of a kind of suspiciousness and an anti-immigrant stance. And then the other kind of example of greater anxiety around immigration in the 90s was the Immigration, I think I have this right, the Immigration Reform and Responsibility Act, which sounds very severe. And what that did is that it deputized some local and state officials to participate in the enforcement of federal immigration law. So both of those seen as kind of more punitive measures.
You know, as you just said, we've been focusing thus far on anxieties and resulting legislation about immigration. And at the same time, there's this image of America as a land of immigrants, right? And celebrating that part of our culture and our history. So let's start to transition a bit and talk about the way that America has welcomed immigrants and how folks who weren't born here have really benefited our society and history.
Absolutely. And this maybe gets, if I can go back, just before the kind of American Revolution, and you probably know this literature better as an early kind of Americanist, but I'm thinking of Jean Crèvecoeur, who was kind of a Frenchman and talked about, the America, the American colonies under kind of British rule as being unique in this motley collection of people from different places, right? And he's speaking about European immigrants, right? So you can see maybe there was boundaries on his vision, but still kind of centering kind of immigration as part of an American identity, right? And then I think the patterns of immigration as the nation kind of grows, immigrants are absolutely fundamental. First, I'll say is kind of labor. They're the ones who are kind of in the fields. It's Chinese and Irish immigrants who build the transcontinental railroad. Immigrants in the factories, immigrants who are kind of nannies and caregivers, right, from kind of very early on, immigrants in restaurants. So I think kind of the labor, the work, the kind of hustle, I think that we associate with immigrants, I think is throughout U.S. history, right? I think we kind of see that thread.
And the kind of expectation that even if folks come in, at a lower economic base, this American dream that is, the hustle that you note, that these are the folks who will go on to be our leaders.
Absolutely. No, I think that rags to riches story, right, which drives immigration, right? And maybe circles back to your kind of early question of kind of why do immigrants come to the United States, right? And I think it is this perception, sometimes realized, that your life can be better, right? That you make it rich, that you can establish opportunities for yourself and for your family. A lot of immigrants, I think historically, have anticipated going home and thought immigration also might be temporary, and then it became more permanent. Because I think the other part of that story is sustained connections to the place from which you left, right? Even over kind of generations. And obviously, depending upon how regulated the border is and how kind of your resources and levels of transportation and communication, that connection can seem kind of stronger or weaker. But in terms of the kind of contributions or how immigrants have shaped kind of U.S. Society, right, beyond kind of the labor, the kind of the innovation, the idea that you could make a better life for yourself and your family. I think immigrants have had such a power effect on American culture, right? Music, art, food, right? Clothes, speech, right? It's hard to find something that is not reshaped and refined by immigrant cultures. And I think that's really exciting and dynamic.
Yeah.
And even though it's given fear, right? That has often been a critique of immigrants, that very that foreignness, right, was seen as a threat, but it's also, I think, it's definitely enriched and strengthened American culture.
Yeah. And you're right, always like a little bit undercut or hemmed in by that anxiety. I think one of the first times as an undergrad that I got really interested in history was taking a 20th century history class, and like some of the cultural requirements that were placed on immigrants, I got obsessed with this idea of assimilation, acculturation, and yes, you can come here, we welcome you, and you need to stop eating smelly food,
right?
And you need to like live in nuclear nuclear units.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, no, and I think there's been many periods when immigrants are identified, are targeted by reformers, right? And who are in some ways benevolent in that they are trying to help newcomers belong, but they're also imposing a pretty narrow understanding of what American culture is, right? And you're right, I think food is so kind of powerful. I think it's a way into other cultures, but it's also like this very primal kind of instinctive repulsion, right, or reaction. So and those campaigns could be pretty insidious, right? Whether it's kind of forcing or requiring immigrants to give up their languages, and not just give up their languages, but to speak English in a very particular way, right? Whether, again, as you're alluding to, how do you keep your house, right? How are you raising your children? What do you do as your pastime, right? There was a lot of criticism about kind of immigrants if there was like a pub culture, right? Or kind of drinking was part of their celebrations. So as that there's kind of a narrowness and an assumption about you need to kind of follow the script too.
Right. Exactly. And if the reason you immigrated to the United States was to increase your economic standing, to do these, to succeed, right? To meet the American dream, there's this internalized pressure, I think, in order to really adopt what is American, which, I think sometimes can create intergenerational conflict.
Absolutely. No.
Or expectations.
Yes. No, it's something that I think students regularly kind of identify in my classes, whether if they talk about kind of grandparents, right, who prohibited their parents from speaking Spanish, right? And then the regret of kind of the third generation that they don't speak Spanish or don't recognize Spanish. And again, it was that that first generation sense that we have to conform, right? We have these expectations, and this again is the model, and don't deviate, don't show kind of evidence of other origins or other cultures.
Are there spaces, and here I'm kind of hedging us to one of your books that you've written in the past, but are there spaces where immigrant groups have been able to escape these pressures and flourish and create new models that aren't so oppressed, for lack of a better word, by these expectations?
So one of my kind of research projects and books was about the kind of interactions of Californians, kind of immigrants and their kind of immediate descendants, roughly from about 1925 till just after World War II. And these are immigrants, Japanese, Jewish, Mexican, Italian, who are living in neighborhoods in large part because of poverty and sometimes because of formal restrictions on housing. So these neighborhoods are really multi-ethnic, and they're very diverse. And so these immigrants are living near one another. They are shopping near one another, and sometimes frequenting one another's kind of social spaces. Their children are going to the same schools. And so what I observed in part, and this had to do with a particular historical moment, right, of World War II, which kind of, I think, ratchets up the conversation about how democracy is or is not being practiced in the United States. This is kind of a moment where those larger conversations about democracy and whether it is being practiced and the shared experience of kind of living and schooling together did inform both informal and then somewhat kind of formal political coalitions among these kind of immigrants and their descendants that challenged some of the worst forms of legal discrimination in California around marriage, right? There were prohibitions on, this is language that is really antiquated, but it was called like an interracial marriage, right? So you couldn't marry someone who wasn't of your defined racial group. But so these groups are kind of rallying against that. Also restrictions on housing. They're also rallying against school segregation. And they have some successes in toppling these laws that supported segregation and discrimination. Oh, wow. Right? So I think and this maybe is a sociologist would be able to delve into this further, but I think part of it is that proximity, right? Those interactions that are inevitable and everyday, that made those kinds of relationships possible.
So it provided ground for alliances, but also it sounds like, as we were talking about, the courage to go against your this country that might be new to you.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm thinking of, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II, and you have some of their schoolmates, right, who suddenly where is so-and-so, and they're writing letters to those former classmates in the incarceration centers, right, expressing just, how are you, right? And I'm sorry that this is happening to you, right? Which I think is an example of that act of courage that you're talking about, that kind of going against the norm, right? Even though it's scarier, feeling that you're not as rooted, that you don't have the position at which to challenge what is the dominant policy.
So, and I think some of the, just to kind of tease out more of like what your book shows and what lessons it might give us right now.
Creating how to create spaces where you interact, right? Where that and in both, I guess, formal ways, highly structured ways, but also informal ways that feel more natural, that feel more casual. I think, not to romanticize youth, but I think kind of young people are willing to be kind of experimental, and to engage in ways that older folks are not. So I think maybe some faith in especially giving or supporting young people in finding those areas for kind of interaction and engagement. For honest kind of conversation. And I guess nowadays that could also be in digital spaces too, right? And I know less about how the boundaries are drawn around those, but to being among people who are different than you are, however that difference is defined, can be really powerful. And that being of value, right? I think that's also like in the 40s and 50s, there's just this broader conversation about increasingly about civil rights, about social justice, about kind of equality, about kind of questioning whether and how that exists, that is part of the larger war effort, right? And things like the Zoot Suit riots, right, which is really challenging mainstream norms and kind of inviting a conversation about kind of difference. And that is a kind of violent confrontation, but even in the aftermath of that, there are discussions about, so what were the kind of root causes of this? Did this happen as it should, or are there kind of systematic reasons that kind of these Mexican American youth are being kind of targeted by police and white sailors? So I think, emphasis, I guess, on youth and a larger social valuing of kind of civil rights and engagement.
I think sometimes an impediment to meeting each other are persistent myths that exist, right? So what are some of the myths that you hear right now percolating about our immigrant communities?
Yes. Yes. And of course, no, sorry, I'm pausing because there's so much out there. I'm trying to figure out where to start. But I think one myth, I think that kind of haunts kind of Latino communities is that they're all undocumented. And in fact, just a very small percentage of Latinos are undocumented. I think the other is that undocumented immigrants are Mexican, right? And I think there are increasing numbers of immigrants from China and from South Asia who are undocumented, right? So thinking about who fits into these kind of categories, who are these immigrants? I think that important to disentangle, right? And a lot of undocumented are visa holders, right? Then who outstay the visas, right? So they're here for kind of a legitimate study or for work, right? I think that's important to remember. I think another myth is that, and this is complicated, that immigrants take American jobs, right? I think there is robust evidence that immigrant labor contributes to economic growth in the United States. And I think as we are an aging population, as the US, like a lot of European countries, is not naturally replacing, I think we're going to need more immigrant labor rather than less. I think it is the case that immigrant workers do send significant monies back home. I think that is part of their the motivation of their immigration and part of their transnational experience. There's some that would argue, if we restrict, and this is kind of a Ralph Nader idea from decades ago.
I 100% had a Ralph Nader button on my backpack when I was in high school. So I hope it's good.
I think so. So. I mean, some argument because one thought is immigrants are doing work that is necessary and that Americans will not. Those are jobs that Americans aren't going to take. Partially because of the wages, partially because of the nature of the labor. And there's some who have countered, well, if you raised the wages, right, if you improve the conditions, right, would those open up, would more Americans be tempted to take those jobs?
Is that what Ralph Nader argued for?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, I feel so validated because it does worry me, this narrative of like, we have to allow folks in so that we can treat them like crap, right? Like that doesn't seem like that.
Yes, that's right. Right? That's right. Yeah. So this idea of expecting inexpensive, kind of abused labor.
Right.
Yeah.
Shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that would cause probably increases in prices of strawberries, right? I mean, some of that would be that some of the goods and services that I think are pretty inexpensive in the United States would get more expensive, but it would also, of course, require employers to pay more, right?
Yeah.
And part of this story is, I think, the limits on organized labor in recent decades, the difficulty of organizing service labor, agricultural labor, and I think so many immigrants are in, hotels and restaurants, and those have been really hard industries to organize. So I think that's also been an impetus to improved conditions, right?
Yeah.
But absolutely, the equation that immigrants will do this labor and the labor will continue to be undesirable and dangerous, right? I mean, that was the original critique of Upton Sinclair, right? It wasn't about how gross the meat production was and how unsanitary. It was how painful and traumatic the experience of an immigrant laborer was. So
I need to reread that. That's in the jungle.
Yeah. I don't know if that's still assigned in high schools. I don't know if our students are still having to read that or not. But so in some ways, that's kind of a long kind of critique, right? And advocacy for immigrants, even if it wasn't read that way at the time. I'm trying to think of other myths or misperceptions. Those are the ones that kind of jump to mind. I think other ones that, that immigrants are criminals, right? That immigrants are over-consuming welfare services, right? That they don't pay taxes. I think all that has been disproven, right? And, I think it is a challenge if the U.S. decides that the demand for immigrants is greater than kind of the ability to absorb newcomers. How do you set a policy that is kind of fair? Some Americans would argue, do citizens have rights different than immigrants? I think the courts have been mixed on this. Who is a citizen, who belongs?
They're tricky questions. They're fundamental questions.
Absolutely, right. And I guess gets at the idea that kind of immigration history is American history, right? That is so fundamental, so entangled. It is who we are, right? So when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about all these other kind of issues.
Wonderful. So what are you working on now?
Well, it is kind of an immigrant-centered project, and it's about food, and particularly about restaurants in California since World War II. So what I'm interested in is how restaurants as spaces where immigrants have labored and where immigrants have innovated, right? As those who are both, I guess, employees and creators, how that has shaped California since World War II, that those restaurants are critical political, cultural, social spaces. But also how those restaurants have been so important to kind of immigrant kind of identity and making kind of a place in California. And part of this, the timing is connected to really the dramatic growth in dining out in the United States and in California in particular.
When does that?
Really after World War II, right? Restaurants have a really kind of interesting history, but in terms of eating out, not cooking at home or eating at someone else's house, that is a practice that accelerates after World War II, and part of it has to do with changes in agricultural production, kind of the move towards bigness in agriculture and more centralization and standardization. It also has to do with the growth of immigration, right? That essentially the workforce emerges to power the growth of these restaurants. And then restaurants have also, for immigrants, it's been a place for them both to feed one another, like familiar foods, familiar ingredients, familiar smells, right? Something that makes you feel like home. It's also been a place of employment for yourself and often your family members. It's not uncommon, not just that your sons and daughters and your cousins are working at your restaurant, but also your sister, right, who just came from Korea. So that has been, I think, really valuable. And as much as food has sometimes been a point of conflict and hierarchy, it can also be a place where others kind of discover immigrant culture through food, that can feel accessible, even if there's always that tension, right? That, oh, well, I love the food, but I don't like the group.
Right.
But there's still some engagement and intersection there. So I've found looking at these restaurants and kind of immigrant labor is a way of looking at changes in actually U.S. immigration policy as more immigrants are moving from work in agriculture into restaurants and what that's meant. Restaurants have been important in the rebuilding of cities, especially downtown Los Angeles after urban uprisings, right? Restaurants have been important to that process. And definitely, I guess, important to kind of immigrant kind of families, and then also how we eat, right? Which is, I think, so distinctive in California. That kind of opens us up.
Wow. Oh, that sounds like, where are we in the process? I want to read it.
Yes. I've got my, I have my contract with UC Press.
Amazing.
And I've been also working with a student who's a history major. She's been helping me with some Spanish language sources, and it's fantastic. She also, she worked in and met her husband at a Peruvian restaurant, right? So she kind of understands the dynamic of restaurants and the language. So she's been great. Jennifer Sanely Galarza, shout out to her. So I'm making kind of some revisions, getting some photographs. So hoping in the next, definitely the next year, hopefully sooner than that. So yeah, I'm excited. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And how did you, just kind of like zooming back even further in your history, how did you become, or why did you become interested in immigration and history?
Yeah, I grew up in Philadelphia, and so the Revolutionary era history is foregrounded there. And my mom took me to Valley Forge, and she would take me to Independence Hall, and I was completely indifferent, and all I wanted was like the ice cream. I was not at all engaged, right? So again, maybe another shout out to kind of parents that expose your kids to stuff that they don't enjoy at the time. So I think thinking back, that's how I got interested in history. And then and I'm not sure why I took the course, but there was a course on the history of American immigration that was taught by Scott Wong. Went to a small school in Massachusetts. And I was like, oh, this is just so interesting, right?
So shout out to good professors.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out to good professors, exactly. And maybe taking unexpected courses too. And I remember, I think and also interesting projects, because the culminating experience of the class was not an exam, but I had to write like a biography of a fellow student who was an immigrant. And I remember interviewing her, and that was my first experience with oral history. That has been an important kind of method, and I really tried to showcase the stories of those I interview. I mean, a lot of quoting. So I hopefully you can hear their voices in a very immediate way. So I think that kind of got me excited about immigration history. And I think coming out to California, that just kind of reinforced it, right? And especially the importance of kind of Asian immigration here, and kind of Mexican and Latin American immigration, which is less pronounced, right? In Philadelphia, there was, significant Vietnamese. There was definitely, descendants of European immigrants, some Puerto Rican immigrants, but it's kind of a different kind of composition here, which is really exciting.
And for students who want to take classes from you, like, what do you teach?
I usually teach the U.S. history survey since it's U.S. history 170B. U.S. history since right after. Maybe. That's right. That's right. And I usually weave in a lot of immigration history there. And then I teach courses on California history, a course on kind of the U.S. West. I do have a course on American immigration history specifically, and a course on U.S. history since 1960, right? So again, all those, even if the topic is not explicitly immigration, usually that kind of works its way in. I think, so I'm trying to think if there's anything. I teach some graduate classes too.
And what are some of your hopes for students who leave your classes? What do you really hope they understand about immigration history?
Yeah, I guess, complexity, nuance, I think sources, right? Understanding also immigrant experience from immigrant perspectives, right? Yeah. I think that is really essential. And I think also this idea that immigration is so fundamental to U.S. history and to American identity, even as it's often kind of contested and argued over. That is really fundamental and it may be impossible to disentangle from kind of U.S. history.
And just to pause you on this comment about sources, because I heard you say this in terms of your goals in writing too. I think when an immigration historian sits down to write their story, what are the choices they're making about sources?
Yes, because there's plenty, and you could probably hear this even in our discussion when I'm talking about legislation and policy, right? There's that kind of those top-down government sources, Supreme Court decisions that are readily available, right? And I think that's really important to see that kind of architecture. But I think immigration history is very much kind of a people's history. So that means going to letters, to memoirs. Often immigration history is, and this is why I think I hope our students are excited given their rich backgrounds, reading and understanding in other languages, right? Oral histories, interviewing kind of the stories that are coming from immigrants. So a lot of times in history, we're relying upon oral histories that were completed, but we also are generating new oral histories, right? So finding for students, interview your parents, interview your grandparents, right? Interview your friends, right? That is an invaluable addition to the historical record, right? I think that also is really valuable over time. That's going to be not kind of a relic, but a kind of a legacy, a memento, right, of your family that you're going to kind of appreciate to hear that person's voice and how they remember their past. I think that's really powerful.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
So we learned what classes you teach.
Yes.
I think you also brought some book recommendations.
I did.
Which we love here.
Yes. So when I was preparing, when Dean Stern kind of invited me, I teach immigration all the time, but I knew we'd have kind of a relatively short period of time. So I kind of went to my bookshelf, and I have many shelves of books about kind of migration and immigration, but I picked out a few to suggest some breadth and some of my favorites. And I don't have to talk about them all, but I can show some of them. One, kind of The Great Departure, and this is about European immigration and really focuses on that, on immigration policy of European kind of countries, which I think we don't always think about because we think about it from the U.S. perspective, but thinking about it as a set of kind of policies either to retain a population or to encourage their departure. I think that's really valuable. And that was one of the large, again, like 20 million immigrants between 1880 and 1920, a lot of them Southern and Eastern European. So I think that's really valuable. This book, I'm interested in immigration broadly, but I also wrote a book about Vietnamese children who were adopted by Americans in the American during the kind of the U.S. war in Vietnam. So I'm interested in Vietnamese kind of refugees, and especially in Orange County, given the large population. And so this book by Jenna Littman, I think is a great kind of reference. She's looking at kind of the Vietnamese refugee experience and also kind of the processing of those kind of refugees in a set of kind of military bases, and this is in 1975 after the U.S. is withdrawing from Vietnam. So that's a great one. deportation, which has unfortunately been also a theme of immigration history since 1880. I think I have the numbers somewhere, but this process, this practice of removing immigrants. So first of all, restricting their entry to begin with, right? What the Chinese Exclusion Act does. But then there is additional scaffolding and administration by which the federal government identifies, tracks, and then removes immigrants. And sometimes, and this Adam Goodman's book is great in covering this, sometimes it's formal, but as often it is informal, but still coerced. So how that has happened over time, I think, is worth looking at. And then I referenced Erica Lee's book earlier in our talk, but she's the one who, among others, but she innovates this idea of gatekeeping as originating in response to Chinese immigration and setting a template or a precedent for current or future and existing immigration policy, right? That from open borders to gates. And then the question is, how high are the gates? How enforced are the gates is in some ways what our immigration is. And then this book is really beautiful. And Minions run all kinds of prizes. It looks at the experience of kind of undocumented Mexican migrants in fairly recent history. She tries to and very successfully explains why the undocumented population has increased, the kind of the power of those ties to regions in Mexico, the remittances, the sports teams that are funded by Mexican immigrants in the United States in their hometowns, and also just the kind of the pains of those separations. So that's another great book to read on your free time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, Dr. Varzally, thank you so much for helping us make immigration history make sense. And we will see you at the panel run by the Titan Dreamer Resource Center.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the opportunity.